All right. Well,
Alrighty.
Nando, let's hear about Bolivia.
Yes. Well, guys, this segment's about Bolivia, and to be honest, good news has been very, very hard to come by in 2020, but this week brought a ray of hope in an otherwise bleak landscape.
Now, Bolivia, it seems, is swinging back towards socialism. According to exit polls, Luis Arce won Sunday's much delayed election and got enough votes to avoid a runoff. He's an ally of exiled former President Evo Morales. The poll was a do-over of last year's contest, which was annulled after allegations of fraud.
That's right. Bolivia is swinging back towards socialism after it had swung pretty dramatically towards fascism in last year's military coup that ousted the elected leader Evo Morales. The result came as a bit of a surprise, as in the weeks before the election, the polls showed that the leading opposition candidate, the neoliberal Carlos Mesa, was close enough to the socialist Luis Arce to maybe force a runoff. But Arce's victory was so thorough, so overwhelming, that the Bolivian right conceded defeat shortly after the polls closed. Now, it's worth reminding people that the coup was triggered after Evo Morales and his Movimiento Socialismo, or MAS, won an election last year. And then immediately after, the Bolivian right claimed that there was massive fraud, and the Organization of American States, this kind of quasi-official international organization, published a report claiming that there was massive fraud. Now, the allegations were not that the fraud was so widespread that Evo actually lost the election. It's just that he didn't win by a big enough margin to avoid a runoff. But the fraud allegations were repeated credulously by the US media, the most prominent of which was probably Yasha Monk. Yasha positions himself as a sort of enlightened centrist liberal scholar type who is above the fray and is laser focused on defending democratic institutions around the world. And to him, what had happened in Bolivia was not a coup d'etat, no siree Bob. It was just that Evo Morales had simply gone too far. Writing in The Atlantic, Yasha writes, like many populists on both the left and the right, Morales claimed to wield power in the name of the people. But after weeks of mass protests in La Paz and other Bolivian cities, and the rapid crumbling of his support both within law enforcement and his own political party, it was his loss of legitimacy amongst the majority of his own countrymen that forced Morales to resign yesterday. What he and some of his most credulous Western supporters described as a coup was in fact something very different. Proof that Bolivians, like the citizens of many other countries around the world, resent arbitrary rule. The longer they have suffered from oppression, the more they have to come to value the democratic institutions that are now threatened by populists around the globe. So yeah, according to Monk, it wasn't a coup. It was simply a social uprising against a dreaded populist who had simply overplayed his hand. Never mind that the military threatened Evo Morales and he had to escape to Mexico and then Argentina, that police forces and other right-wing thugs beat up and then murdered MAS supporters on the street, that leading figures of the MAS party were arrested, and that Janine Áñez, a far-right politician with no support, took power and declared herself president in the name of God himself.
Nuestra fuerza es Dios, el poder es Dios. Que Dios nos bendiga, queridos hermanos bolivianos.
Yeah, that doesn't look like someone who believes they're going to be a caretaker interim president. And in the wake of Áñez's takeover, people took to the streets, and her government immediately responded with violent repression.
Protesters in Bolivia show empty bullet casings and tear gas canisters. Debris from Friday's violent clashes with police that left 9 people dead and more than 100 injured.
And Patricia Arce, the left-wing mayor of a town called Vinto, was taken and covered in red paint while they forcibly cut her hair as City Hall burned.
En este preciso momento está quemándose la alcaldía de Vinto.
Estás negando todo, mierda. Te hemos visto, carajo. Te has contratado tú. Ahí estaban los camiones y te niegas todo. Y a mis hermanos les dices maleantes. Violadores, carajo. Tú tienes la culpa de todo, mierda.
So yeah, despite having all the hallmarks of a coup, the media and the political class in the United States were invested in the idea that this was not, in fact, a coup, and that this week's election are proof of that. Like this tweet from the journalist Oz Katerji, what happened in Bolivia is proof that Bolivian democracy is alive and well, not, as some would have had you believe, a far-right lithium-based CIA Elon Musk joint venture. The free and fair election people argued wouldn't happen actually happened. That's simply a fact. I mean, and that's like saying Someone who tried to murder you but didn't succeed in doing so, well, then there's nothing to see here, folks. Because the reality is that it was a coup, and that coup spawned a massive uprising of a well-organized and militant coalition of social movements and trade unions that wound up defeating the coup. It's not like elections just happened. They were imposed from below. So how did they do it? Well, in August, when the Áñez government announced that the promised elections were actually going to be delayed, they called a general strike and essentially shut down the country by clogging some of the major arteries between the cities.
La manifestación más numerosa tuvo lugar en la región de campesinos productores de coca del Chapare en el departamento de Cochabamba, donde también se instalaron bloqueos de la carretera que une a ese departamento con Santa Cruz.
Por lo tanto, nosotros exigimos que de una vez por todas, para no llegar a mayores problemas, que el órgano electoral y por supuesto este gobierno de facto, que supuestamente solo entraron a hacer elecciones que den certeza al pueblo boliviano, que nos digan la verdad al pueblo boliviano, ¿va a haber o no va a haber elecciones en nuestro Estado plurinacional de Bolivia?
En la ciudad del Alto, el Distrito 8 se plegó al bloqueo de calles y avenidas y un grupo de personas se instaló frente al Tribunal Electoral para exigir lo que se ha venido en denominar respeto a la democracia.
So yeah, I know that was in Spanish, but you can see that people went out into the streets. They talk about how they blocked the roads to Santa Cruz, and there was a labor leader demanding elections, like they won't stop until the elections happened. And Bolivian workers managed to hold the line for over 2 weeks, demanding a firm date for the elections. And think about how remarkable it is to pull off something like that in the middle of a pandemic and a crippling economic crisis. Finally, the government caved, and elections were held on October 18th. And the Bolivian case is a perfect example of how a left needs to contest for power in elections, but it also needs to have organizational discipline rooted in social movements and the working class. The Bolivian general strike, for example, was called for by La Central Obrera Boliviana, or Bolivian Workers' Center, a federation of trade unions that has 2 million members. Remember, Bolivia only has 11 million people total. And Evo Morales himself came up from a different union, the CSU-TCB, or the Confederación Sindical Unida de Trabajadores Campesinos de Bolivia, which is more rooted in the rural peasantry and coca growers, and the real power center for the MAS. And this idea that a political party must compete at the ballot box, but also be involved in permanent social struggle in the workplace and elsewhere, has been crucial at making MAS a robust and enduring force in Bolivian society.
You know, the movement towards socialism was founded with the idea that the social struggle and the electoral struggle have to go together. They can't go apart. Because throughout Latin American history, you've had social struggle without electoral participation, guerrilla groups, this sort of thing. And that has led to victory in very few places. In a lot of places like Colombia, it's led to protracted civil wars, repression, etc. But likewise, if you just take an electoral approach without that social base, without that social struggle, well, you'll go the way of 1 million left-wing parties that you have in every country around the world. Maybe you do well, 1 or 2 elections, disappear a couple of years later. And that's the history of the Bolivian left as well. There's numerous left-wing parties that have done very well electorally, didn't win, but then disappear a few years later. But the MAS is something much deeper than that, because they combine electoral participation with permanent social struggle on the ground, in the indigenous communities, in workplaces. And that's something that's been going throughout this whole year.
That's the journalist Ali Vargas, who's been in Bolivia doing invaluable reporting. Check him out if you haven't already. And he's absolutely right. For years, there has been the fear that MAS's success was tied almost exclusively to Evo Morales' unique charisma and personal popularity, a bit like Hugo Chavez in Venezuela or Lula in Brazil. And that sometimes has been a problem for the left. I mean, with the decks stacked against the left by the forces of international capital, often it takes a special leader to take us over the edge and into state power. But that can be a double-edged sword, and it becomes very easy to defeat the movement by chopping off its head. And that's what they tried to do with Evo. They figure, well, he's run 4 times and he's won 4 times. Let's just exile him and the MAS will fall apart. But it didn't. And that's because the MAS has deep roots in an organized and militant working class movement. In 2005, they took power by explicitly challenging the neoliberal governing consensus, which had ravaged the country.
These are historic times in Bolivia. The people have just elected their first ever indigenous president, with the biggest mandate in Bolivian electoral history. Evo Morales comes not from the traditional political elite, but from a poor family of coca farmers and tin miners. He was elected on a platform of resistance to neoliberalism, a type of free market economy that's largely been forced on Bolivia by international bodies like the World Bank.
Wait a minute. That voice sounds familiar. What? Wait, Kale, keep playing the clip.
Hi, I'm here in Bolivia with Christian Aid. I'm at about 3,800 meters above sea level on the Altiplano, very close to Lake Titicaca. And I can tell you it's pretty hard to breathe. I'm here to meet some of Christian Aid's partner organizations who work with the poorer communities. Really, I'm on a fact-finding trip to discover how well the free market model serves Bolivia, the poorest country in South America.
That's right. Bobby Axelrod himself, Captain Winters himself, went to Bolivia in 2006 and produced this anti-neoliberalism documentary where he showed how privatization had destroyed the living standards of the working class.
Very low corporate taxes means that once again Bolivians have been shortchanged. Gas production might have increased dramatically, but not Bolivia's share of the profits. The contradiction is clear. On the one hand, large number of people living in terrible poverty. On the other, massive multinationals taking home record profits.
I can't get over seeing Bobby Axelrod say massive amounts of people living in terrible poverty while massive corporations reaping record profits. Well, Evo Morales changed all that. His 14 years in power saw truly spectacular economic growth while reducing poverty and inequality. According to a report by the Center for Economic Policy and Policy Research, by 2018, real GDP per capita had increased by 50% above its 2005 level, the year Morales took power. While the region overall has experienced a sharp slowdown over the last 5 years, Bolivia's per capita GDP growth was the highest in South America. Since 2006, Bolivia's real per capita GDP has grown at double the rate for Latin America, and Bolivia's unemployment was nearly halved from 7.7% to 4.4% in 2008 and has continued at roughly around that level through 2018. He did this while bringing millions of people who were previously shut out of Bolivia's political process into the political process. He reconfigured the state to recognize the sovereignty of the various indigenous nations that populate the country. And according to Olivia Argos Stiles, writing in Jacobin, the newfound visibility and prominence of indigenous peoples in Bolivia have been the undisputed success of MAS in power. They are now represented as political actors at the state level and across society. For the first time, cholitas, women who wear urban indigenous dress, can now be seen presenting the news or taking up various public office roles. So, now what for Bolivia? Well, the new president, Luis Arce, is a very different man from Evo Morales.
Luis Arce was the key number 2, number 3 person in Evo Morales' government for the whole of the past 14 years. In terms of governing style, very different, of course. Evo Morales is a union leader. He came up from the rank and file, whereas Luis Arce is part of the middle class. He was educated in the UK. He's in the sort of expert economist. But he's a socialist. Before joining the government, before becoming economy minister, he had a very important sort of study circle here in La Paz called Los Duendes, which was sort of a Marxist economic study circle where they draw up plans about how you can build an economy post-neoliberalism. That's why he was chosen by Evo Morales, chosen by the vice president at the time, Garcia Linera, to join the government. He was moving in the same sort of Marxist intellectual circles.
You see that? He was running a Marxist economic study circle called Los Duendes. You see that? Even you, Jacobin book club organizer, can become president someday. But Arce will face enormous challenges going forward. Obviously, there's the pandemic, which, sucks for everyone. But he would also have to do a lot of the economic harm that the Bolivian right did in the short time that they were in power. According to the Washington Post, the novel coronavirus has devastated the country, killing more than 8,500 of its 11.6 million people, one of the world's highest mortality rates, and further undercut an economy already hobbled by drops in commodities prices and slowdowns in exports. The economy contracted nearly 8% in the first half of the year, and unemployment shot to nearly 12% in a country where broad social initiatives had lowered that rate to less than 4%. But Arce was one of the main architects of Evo Morales' economic successes. The question is, will he have the political skill of Morales to govern a country that is quite polarized along class lines? And he will also have to deal with, let's face it, hostility coming from Washington. Evo Morales was always very confident while bucking the Washington consensus, but even a Biden administration would likely be opposed to socialism in Bolivia. Here is a tweet from Ben Rhodes, Barack Obama's top foreign policy advisor, and a man considered to be on the far left of the national security blob. I mean, he's a critic of the national security blob. He tweeted, "The Trump-Rubio doctrine of incompetent imperialism is a strong wind in the sails of the Latin American left." So what would a Biden-Rhodes doctrine of competent imperialism mean for the Latin American left? Likely nothing great. But hopefully, Bolivia and the victory of the MAS can provide hope and inspiration for the rest of the region.
Nando, such a great segment. And I especially love that you did hone in on how this past election was so successful, because it's not easy to fight against American imperialism. As we know, the United States was very much behind the OAS's decision to do what it did. The OAS is overwhelmingly funded by the United States. In fact, Marco Rubio has been so hyper-focused on ousting Evo Morales. And while I have my thoughts, we have the pleasure and the privilege of having Professor Richard Wolff join us already. So I would love to have him join in to help us discuss this a little more. Professor Wolff, thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. I do want to apologize. I have Band-Aids on here because my dermatologist said I should do that. I've covered them as best I could, but I'm not in trouble or anything. I thought I should tell you.
Oh, no worries at all. No worries at all. So, I wanted to, just get your thoughts on Bolivia and, the fact that they managed to hold the elections with workers taking to the streets, blocking the streets, doing what they can to ensure that the elections were held, because they were postponed several times.
Well, I could not agree more. And I really do deeply appreciate the report that I've been watching that Nando just put together. My hat's off to you. That kind of journalism I see so rarely, left, right, or center. Really lovely. A piece of work that makes all the crucial points. And here's the ones that talk to me most. The comment by the gentleman from Great Britain that the remarkable success of the MAS movement was this combining of the political party with the social movements on the ground, particularly those rooted in the labor movement. That was the way that socialism in the 19th century grew as spectacularly in the second half of that century as it did. And the difficulty of holding that kind of a combination together has been the bane of the left all over the place, including here in the United States, for a long time. So that focus is crucial. Another point I appreciated, and that I say a bit more with my personal involvement, is that you have an economist who has been working not only in the practical matters of being economics minister and dealing with the problems Morales had and his government had, but took the time to produce and to participate in a circle of like-thinking Marxist economists trying to understand how, in a world so dominated by capitalism and capitalist imperialism, how can you carve out, a way forward? And they found one in Bolivia, and they have now found it again. And this is a remarkable testimony to the benefit of, if you pardon the cliche, you're doing theory and practice rather than debating which is the more important, Do them both, let them cross-fertilize, and you will get remarkable results like this defeat of the coup, which is what this is, and which Nando foregrounded in a way I really want to compliment.
Wow, thank you. I'm going to tell my grandchildren someday.
Please, write it down. Don't lose it.